Hello and welcome to lecture number 26. Today we're talking about America on the world stage. It's historical topic 4.4 and the theme that we're looking at is America in the world. We have learning objective today, explain how and why American foreign policy developed and expanded over time. And we begin with this key concept. Struggling to create an independent global presence, the United States sought to claim territory throughout the North American continent and promote foreign trade. So, the United States was having their neutrality challenged during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. So this is during the time in which Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are presidents. Both Britain and France are harassing American ships at sea, but Britain is impressing U.S. sailors. That means that they were abducting them from their ships and then forcing them to work on the British Navy ships. Jefferson responds with the Embargo Act of 1807. That means that we are not going to trade at all with Great Britain from 1807 until 1809, until we changed the law. This was hugely unpopular. As you see on the top left, there's a political cartoon in which the Democratic Republicans are being criticized for hurting the economy, and it hurts the economy greatly without really impacting Great Britain too much. So they continue to impress American sailors even with the Embargo Act of 1807. When Jefferson leaves office in 1808 or early months of 1809, Madison becomes president, and his reaction to the British actions at sea is the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. And now this is going to be similar to the Embargo Act, but now we're including France. Both France and Britain are not going to be allowed to trade with the United States. Any American shipping company or ship that trades with them is technically breaking the law. Now, this gets old. The people in the United States are tired of it because it's hurting them economically, and so Congress responds with Makin's Bill number 2. And it promised that the U.S. was going to support whichever side pledged that they would resume neutrality rights for the United States. And Napoleon sees this as a great opportunity. He tells James Madison that France will be the one who will respect the United States neutrality, and if they now take an aggressive stance towards Great Britain. Madison takes Napoleon's bait and puts in a more aggressive stance against Great Britain, yet Napoleon and the French did not change their actions against the United States at sea. So it was kind of a failure, which will lead us to the War of 1812. So the U.S. government sought influence and control over the Western Hemisphere through a variety of means, including military actions, American Indian removal, and diplomatic efforts such as the Monroe Doctrine. So since we're on the topic of the War of 1812, we'll continue here. The U.S. entered over the violations of their neutrality rights. There was a section of Democratic Republicans who were the young up-and-comer, mostly from the South, representatives who were called war hawks, and they wanted a declaration of war against Great Britain. The Old Federalists were not in favor of a war with Great Britain. As you remember, the Federalists, they had a better relationship with Great Britain. They wanted closer economic ties with them, so they opposed it, but because they were losing influence in Congress, they do not get their way. When the war begins and the United States begins to fight against the British, we invade Canada, but that goes poorly for the United States. They are repelled. The British put in place a blockade around the United States, which hurts the economy. The British make an attack in the Chesapeake region, which leads to the White House being burnt. James Madison and his wife, Dolly Madison, basically have to run out of the White House as it's burning. Dolly Madison thinks quickly and preserves a portrait of George Washington that was hanging in the White House. And we do see some success in the South as the war is ending. In the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson gets a military victory, but the military victory comes about 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been signed. There are some extensions of the War of 1812 that extends to Native Americans who had allied with the British, and so some separate conflicts that we were fighting against Native Americans become part of this larger War of 1812 conflict. Now, Andrew Jackson, after the War of 1812, was ordered to pursue raiders in Florida, and under his own command, he destroys Seminole villages, drives out the Spanish governor. So he takes his orders and kind of goes above and beyond what he had been asked to do, which leads to a growth of his national renown for all of the things that he's becoming involved with. Now, for diplomatic efforts, the Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. You see in the painting above, you have the British minister shaking hands with John Quincy Adams in the middle of the frame. There was no real success or concession that either side gave. The British were pretty tired of fighting wars, and as things were winding down in Europe, they did not want to continue fighting a war in the United States. The Rush-Bagot Agreement is another treaty that we make with Great Britain, and it establishes that the U.S. and Canada border we're going to limit the fortifications that we put along it. And then the Treaty of 1818 sets the 49th parallel as the border between the United States and British Canada. So you can see on the map here on the bottom right that we gain a little bit of territory that was not part of the original Louisiana Purchase as a result of that treaty. And then in 1819, after Andrew Jackson had driven out the Spanish governors, we purchased Florida from the Spanish. The Spanish were also trying to limit the amounts of revolutions that were happening in South America, Central America. All right, continuing on the same key concept with American Indian removal, the biggest movement that we see is one led by Tecumseh and his younger brother. The Prophet is what he went by, or what people called him. They were trying to create a confederacy of Native American tribes in the west portion of the United States, and they begin fighting Tecumseh's War before the War of 1812, and it goes into the War of 1812. It becomes part of the larger conflict. But Tecumseh is killed in one of these battles in 1815, and so that movement ends. After the war, Andrew Jackson will become very involved in American Indian relations, and he will become a negotiator trying to get the southeastern tribes to move out west. One of the few tribes that took that deal that was offered, or really being pushed by Jackson, were the Choctaw. And so they were one of the first tribes to make it to the Oklahoma Territory that becomes a large Indian reservation. And then lastly, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a response to the other European powers in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish were already beginning to lose their power, but there was a question over how much effort they would try to put in to regain their colonies. And there was also Russia making their way down from Alaska. They made it as far south to San Francisco. And so James Monroe puts forth this idea that was crafted by John Quincy Adams, that any European power that has the intention of colonizing in the Western Hemisphere is going to have to go through the United States first. The United States didn't really have the naval power or the firepower to back up their words. We were actually really relying on Great Britain backing up our words, because Great Britain still had Canada, and they also did not want any other European rivals in North America or the Western Hemisphere. And so we knew that if we put out this very strong statement, that we would have some backing from Britain, because this was really targeting some of Britain's own European rivals, the Spanish and the Russians. All right, here's the recap for today. The United States tried to maintain its neutrality at sea, but tensions escalated into war. That war was the War of 1812. It was not a great success for the United States, but it solidified its place in the world stage. It showed that it could stand up against Great Britain once more, and it solidified that it was not going to be taken over and it was going to maintain its independence. More expansion into the Western Territory and addition of Florida pushes out American Indians, and finally the Monroe Doctrine warns Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. The power to enforce this was less clear, but we were really relying on our ally, Great Britain, to help us enforce it. All right, that's it for this lecture. Please join us in the next lecture in which we will talk about the market revolution.